Welcome back to the History Podcast. I'm Gustavus.
And I'm Christina. Today we're diving into, a really pivotal moment in European history. We're talking about the Battle of Poltava.
Yeah, it's a big one. It was part of this much larger conflict, the Great Northern War, which lasted from 1700 all the way to 1721. It was basically Russia, along with allies like Denmark, Norway, and Saxony, Poland, against the Swedish Empire.
And initially, Sweden was pretty dominant, right? They had these early victories, but Russia, to their credit, they really rebuilt their military and they started pushing back, trying to contest Sweden's power in the Baltic region. It was quite the comeback.
Absolutely. And then, in 1708, the Swedish king, Charles XII, he invades Russia. He actually captures Poltava, which is where we get the name for this battle. His big idea was to defeat Peter the Great's army before any reinforcements could arrive.
Which sounds like a good strategy in theory, but, he was also counting on support from Ukrainian Cossacks, led by Hetman Ivan Mazepa, who had actually defected from Russia. So a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, a lot of pieces on the chessboard there. So speaking of armies, let's talk about the forces involved. On the Swedish side, they had about 24,000 to 25,000 men initially, but only 4 cannons. Can you believe it?
4 cannons. That's wild. And they were already kind of, weakened due to casualties and supply issues, eventually dropping to maybe 17,000 to 24,000. And Charles XII himself, he was wounded before the battle even started. So that's not exactly ideal leadership conditions.
No, not at all. Well, on the Russian side, they were much better equipped. Clearly, they had somewhere between 42,500 and 80,000 men and a whopping 102 artillery pieces. Quite the difference. And they were led by Tsar Peter, IV, himself, and Prince Alexander Menshikov.
Yeah, a clear advantage in numbers and firepower for Russia. So the campaign to Poltava itself, Charles actually laid siege to the city starting in April of 1709. But his early assaults, they really kind of failed, mostly because, they just didn't have enough artillery or gunpowder.
Which, again, circles back to that 4 cannons point. Meanwhile, Peter the Great, he's reinforcing his army. He's preparing these really strong fortified positions north of Poltava, just kind of waiting for the Swedish attack.
And then the battle itself. On July 8th, 1709, it all kicked off at dawn, around 5 a.m., with the Swedish infantry striking the Russian lines. They had some initial success, capturing a few redoubts, but they quickly ran into heavy artillery and cavalry resistance.
That's where it all started to turn, really. Prince Menshikov, he executed this incredible flank attack that almost completely encircled the Swedes. And as the Russians poured in more and more reinforcements, the Swedish lines just buckled under the pressure.
Yeah, by about 9 a.m., so just a few hours in, the Swedish forces were pretty much breaking. Charles, he ordered a retreat with Renskild's cavalry trying to cover the withdrawal, but the infantry was just decimated under constant sustained artillery fire. It was just a complete, unmitigated disaster for them.
Yeah, just devastating. And the casualties really reflect that. For the Swedes, about 6,900 killed or wounded, and another 2,800 captured right there on the battlefield, plus another 12,000 they surrendered a few days later at Peravollakna, including Renskild himself.
Oof. So many captured. The Russians, however, their losses were significantly lighter, around 1,300 killed and 3,300 wounded. And King Charles XII, amazingly, he actually managed to escape with Mazepa and, maybe 1,000 to 3,000 men across the Dnieper River to Ottoman-held Bender. So he got away, but his army was pretty much destroyed.
That's the real takeaway here. This battle, It truly marked the collapse of Sweden's supremacy in the Baltic. And it really heralded the rise of the Russian Empire as this dominant force in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, it's a massive geopolitical shift. Sweden, which had been this major European power, effectively saw its era end, and Russia, conversely, rose to become the dominant force. It also showcased Russia's modernized army, their proficiency in things like earthworks, artillery, and really coordinated operations.
It also had a big impact on Ukraine, unfortunately. Mazeppa's defection and the subsequent defeat, it essentially ended the Cossacks' hopes of Ukrainian autonomy within Sweden's sphere of influence. So it was quite a blow.
And for the Great Northern War as a whole, Poltava really reinvigorated the anti-Swedish coalition, leading to new alliances with powers like Britain and Prussia, and eventually that Treaty of Nystad in 1721. So, in essence, Poltava was just a decisive confrontation.
Absolutely. It was a confrontation where Russia's modernized military under Peter the Great just decisively defeated the Swedish army, signaling the end of Swedish hegemony, the rise of Russia, and it completely reshaped Northern European geopolitics.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's dive into the Battle of Poltava. What a fascinating, if somewhat tragic, turning point in history.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on the History Podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the past.
See you then.